We are delighted to welcome our next speaker, Bradley C. Birkenfeld, popularly known as Lucifer's banker. He is arguably the most influential financial whistleblower in history. As an international private banker, Bradley exposed how UBS, the world's largest bank, helped wealthy Americans evade tax. In an unprecedented move, he was awarded $104 million by the IRS, largest payout of its kind in US history. In 2016, he authored a tell-all book, Lucifer's Banker, the untold story of how I destroyed Swiss banks' secrecy. Now retired, Bradley is a philanthropist and supports whistleblowing efforts worldwide. He says, "If you see a crime, it's important that you report it, because if you don't, you're part of that crime. I have 104 million reasons why I'm right."
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here this afternoon for this wonderful event. I'm honored to be here and to talk about my story to the general public as well as professionals around the world. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Bradley Birkenfeld. I'm the UBS whistleblower. I exposed the largest and longest-running tax scandal in the world at UBS in Switzerland. Today, I intend to talk about three general areas which will cover offshore banking, government corruption, and worldwide whistleblowing. I think it's important for the audience to understand the gravity to what we're talking about here with respect to whistleblowing. With respect to offshore banking, it's important to realize the magnitude of what Switzerland had for offshore banking. Switzerland had around 135 financial institutions in Geneva, where I worked when I left there in 2008. As of today, there's around 75. So that shows you what has happened in a transformation due in part to my historic whistleblowing. I think more and more people need to understand that whistleblowing should be embraced, not pushed back. So what has happened in Switzerland when I was working there, it's allowed to have the secret numbered accounts that we all know so much about. But this came at a price, and this was then started at a time in which the world was in upheaval. When the Third Reich came to power in 1933, the problem was that if anyone had moved money out of Germany, the Third Reich would kill you. That was a law imposed by the Nazi regime at the time. Switzerland countered with Article 47 in their constitution, which was Swiss bank secrecy, where they would not disclose anyone's identity to anyone for any reason. Unfortunately, that law, such as attorney-client privilege, medical privilege, clergy privilege, was abused. And Switzerland abused this privilege years and years later. Hence why you had so many problems with criminal activity and money laundering going on within their borders. When I worked at UBS, I saw that some of these things didn't make sense, and I complained vehemently about what they were doing in the offshore banking world. Unfortunately, that fell on deaf ears. So the problem was what was I supposed to do? Was I supposed to just be quiet, or was I supposed to do something about it? Clearly, you're either part of the problem or you're part of the solution. So I had to step forward and do what I felt was right as a director at UBS, which was report it to my legal and compliance teams. That's exactly what I did. But unfortunately, I was rebuffed. I was told not to talk about it, and they never gave me an answer, even a legitimate answer. So I knew at that point that the bank was covering this up. So I felt as though I had to resign from the bank, which I did, back actually 16 years ago this week. This was important because what happened was, again, if you see something that's so criminally corrupt, you don't want to be a part of it. And I certainly didn't want to be a part of this. People would argue that you were doing this business. Yes, certainly I was. But within the Swiss confines and the Swiss Constitution, what I did was legal. When I started to see what we were doing was illegal, I stopped it and reported it and resigned. So we go forward. What was the offshore banking world affected by these actions? The actions I took were so unprecedented, it transformed the entire industry. A multi-trillion-dollar industry, not just in Switzerland, but in other offshore jurisdictions as well. I think it's important for people to understand that this business has undermined all facets of society, from the economics, the political, and social sides of society, that if you don't change them, then what's going to happen is they're going to get worse. And we've seen that. So recently, we have seen everything from Panama Papers to Pandora's Papers to LuxLeaks and so forth. Why have these happened? Because people have continued to break the law and feel as though they're above the law. We have offshore jurisdictions in Monaco, in Luxembourg, the Channel Islands, and so on and so forth. These areas have been attacked, and rightly so, because they're breaking the law. And I think the governments, which is really quite unbelievable, is they have done very little to stop this. And it's taken courageous whistleblowers to come forward. Many whistleblowers who have been ostracized because what they did was the right thing. In my country, in America, where I grew up, we have two famous whistleblowers as well that come to mind, Edward Snowden and then Julian Assange, of course, tied up with WikiLeaks. I met with Julian Assange twice at the Ecuadorian embassy. And what I found for him to tell me was quite revealing, because that gets into the amount of government corruption that's behind this. The fact that I exposed so much wrongdoing at UBS, 19,000 clients, $20 billion in assets, shows that this was an ongoing problem that the US government really didn't want to do anything about. Unfortunately, for me, I came in and told them about it and made sure they knew about it and wanted something done. So the problem was that the US government is complicit in this criminal act. Why? Because they knew about it and did nothing about it. But then I came in and gave them the information. So that's something very important for people to understand. Can you trust your government to do the right thing? Unfortunately, in this case, you cannot. The US government is part of the problem, they're part of the crime, and they continue to do so. The FBI and DOJ are just window dressing for a law enforcement agency that says that they're doing the right thing. And I can prove that that is not the case. One case in point was WikiLeaks released a document in which Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State at the time, was put in charge of this investigation. It doesn't make sense to have a Secretary of State in charge of an international criminal investigation, but she did. But she didn't get all the 19,000 names, she only got 25% of them. And they didn't find the bank properly, and they let all the other directors and managing partners of UBS go. But they did indict the whistleblower, me, and they put me in jail. But the problem with that, further than that, is who picked the names of those 4,700? And why weren't there other indictments done? As well as, why was Barack Obama receiving millions of dollars from UBS at the very same time he was in the US Senate investigating UBS for their criminal conduct? Why? So you can see that it goes to the highest levels of US government where they're complicit. The day that I was sentenced to prison, in August of 2009, the president was playing golf with the chairman of UBS on Martha's Vineyard. So it just goes to show you the corruption that takes place in America. This is something that needs to be rectified, not just in America, but here in Europe as well. Germany certainly is another country that should change their laws. And this is what I'd like to do, is try and help the German people, the Europeans, take the American whistleblowing laws and change them. Why? Because it's good for society. It's good for everyone to benefit from a good whistleblowing program. If the whistleblowing program is put in place properly, the proceeds from the crime are then paid to the whistleblower, not from the taxpayer. So shouldn't we embrace this? Shouldn't law enforcement really embrace whistleblowing and whistleblowers? So when you see people like Julian Assange or Snowden incarcerated and maltreated, this is not the way in which we want to send the message. But this is what the big and powerful politicians, wealthy people do. They attack the people that are exposing the truth. And what we need is the truth to be told. Haven't we learned our lesson over the last few decades that this is the way in which society should work? So I'm begging people to understand, change the laws here in Europe. Make sure you understand why we should be doing this. Because when you change the laws, what will happen is you'll be incentivizing whistleblowers for not only getting compensated for exposing the big corporate crimes and in government, but also you'll be protecting them. Because whistleblowers today don't know where to go. They're left out in the cold. And this is something we don't want, because they're doing the right thing. Now, some people would argue, ethically, they should do it anyways. But until you understand what a whistleblower goes through, and certainly I've been there, and I know many others who have faced big legal bills, harassment, intimidation, finances lost, breaking up marriages, this is not right. And I think what we need to do is send a strong message to the corporate world, this will not be tolerated. And I think in America, they've started to do that more and more with the laws, and they've strengthened them. So I think this is something I would really appreciate doing here with colleagues here in Europe to help change the laws. And I would open the door to any politician in Europe who would listen to this argument that this is really good for society, and why are you ignoring it? Furthermore, I think what you have here is on the worldwide whistleblowing, we have a problem in which a lot of whistleblowers not only come forward with the information, but then they get retaliated and harassed. And I think the problem with that is, how do they ever overcome this? How do they ever get another job again? So this is very, very hard for them to understand. And I think more of the people that I dealt with, they feel as though that they have no other option. So they go to alcoholism or drugs, divorce, and so forth. So this is very, very important. Coming back to the government corruption, again, when I talked to Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy, he gave me a lot of information that was very troubling about the US government. And recently, the article has come out where the CIA was plotting to either kidnap him or kill him. So this is so disingenuous, and it's deplorable to think that a US government would even be contemplating about kidnapping or killing a whistleblower like Julian Assange. The problem with Julian Assange is not what he did. The fact was he told the truth and exposed everything that the US government was doing illegally. I repeat, illegally. So why are you going to blame him for exposing the truth? And I think that's really the essence of what we're talking about with whistleblowing. Furthermore, when he released the document showed on WikiLeaks, which is on my website, lucifersbanker.com, it shows that the Swiss finance minister and Hillary Clinton had negotiated 2 Chinese Uyghurs from Guantanamo Bay to be settled in Switzerland to settle the UBS tax fraud case. Now, what does that have to do with the economics and justice? It has nothing to do with it. That shows, once again, the ingrained corruption within the US government. It's not about justice. It's about hiding the truth. And that's something we didn't want. But WikiLeaks uncovered it, thank goodness. And that document, as I say, is on my website. And that is something that's very powerful. And I discussed it with Julian at the Ecuadorian embassy when I met with him in London. And I think more and more now, when I see the treatment he's receiving in the UK, it's despicable. And I think that's really a lightning rod for many people to see and to understand why this should not be tolerated. Furthermore, now what has happened is more cases against UBS have been taking place. Here in Germany, there's been settlements, Italy, Spain. But in France, we've had a different scenario. The scenario there is they've had a trial. Not just a trial, but the trial has gone to an appeal, and the trial has now come to a verdict. And we're going to get that verdict on December 13th of this year. Why is that important? Because I testified in that case. I testified in that case for 10 hours, but yet my own government wouldn't allow me to travel to France to testify to help an ally in a criminal investigation. That's very telling. I had to have a French subpoena issued to me through the French embassy in Washington, D.C. to travel to France. So this tells you the lengths I went to try and help uncover the fraud. And my own government obstructed me from doing it. This is the Department of Justice that we're talking about. It's not about justice. It's about politics. And the problem is the politics run so deep with large institutions like a UBS, I think we have to continue to not only boycott UBS, but to expose all their criminal conduct around the world. Not just here in Europe, it's global. So I've detailed many of the transgressions that UBS has committed, and I think this is a very telling story, a case study, if you will, for many people to understand that this is something that we have to understand at number one, but we have to stop at number two. Because if you don't stop it, there's too many victims. There's victims of UBS shareholders, Swiss taxpayers, who are bearing the burden of massive legal bills and big settlements, which they pass on to the taxpayers. People who had nothing to do with the crime are paying the price. Why? This is really quite disingenuous, not only from the standpoint of a corporate culture and corporate governance, but just general sense, basic common sense. So I think now we have to say to ourselves, what's the next step we're going to do here? How are we going to change this? And again, I come back to changing the laws here in the European Union. This will send a strong message, not only to the corporations, but also to governments who think they can get away with this. Recently, we've seen the Pandora Papers, and all the governments named there were quickly to come out and say, we deny it. Well, of course you're going to deny it. You're not going to come out and admit you were breaking the law, even though you got caught red-handed. So this is something that we must do. We must come and say, well, why haven't you investigated this offshore money laundering, tax evasion business that's been going on for years? Because it's part of their society. It's ingrained in their culture. This is something that must change. Settlements with banks don't solve the problem. You don't set a good precedent by having a settlement. That just means you'll go and do it again. You'll just write a check. And then there's no deterrent. So you could really pretty much keep breaking the law, pay a fine, and continue on your merry way. I refer to it as political prostitution. That's exactly what it is. Because what's happening is these politicians fail to understand that the society in which they govern is fed up with this, and they want change. It doesn't have to be radical change, it just has to be change that makes sense for the common man and woman. In the society where you pay taxes, where your children go to school, where you do your business, why shouldn't that be a place you want to work in rather than hearing these stories time and time again of offshore tax evasion, money laundering, and so forth? Even here in Germany, when I arrived here in Munich a few days ago, there was an article about 1,000 police agents who were spread across 3 states here in Germany to stop money laundering related to terrorist financing. Now, this is a very serious problem. If we don't get to the core of it, it will continue to masticize and grow. And I think that's what we're talking about here, is this whole system of the money laundering and tax evasion systems across Europe and the world. And I think America has certainly played a big part in allowing this to continue as well. The other question would be, where is the central bank? Where's the Bundesbank? Where's the Federal Reserve? Where are they during all of this? Why haven't they done something to rectify this? And why haven't they made people pay the price for their crimes? The largest banks in the world have continued to break the law, but nothing happens. They just pay a price. Now, that's not a price that people should be willing to pay because they can just write a check. So I think it's important, again, for people to understand that whistleblowers are left behind here who expose this, and yet the big corporations get to walk away free. So it's very, very dangerous. My point about Switzerland and how they've transformed some of their actions has really been troubling as well. And I think the European Union certainly should be taking greater action against Switzerland with regard to the banking systems. They use things within their own society to protect their system of banking. Unfortunately, that system is now over. They have to stop this bank secrecy. And the people who are behind it, accountants, lawyers, bankers, trustees, and politicians and judges, should be held accountable. They've continued to perpetuate this system to the detriment of others, not just governments, not just corporations, but individuals as well. So I think that's something that's very important for people to understand. As I said, when I worked in Switzerland for 15 years, I saw all of these banks operating in the same capacity, hiding money, taking advantage of clients, as well as making sure that governments never found out the information they really sought after. But it goes beyond just tax. When there's tax, that's one issue. The other matter is it goes into criminal activity, such as gun smuggling, human trafficking, prostitution, drugs, and so forth. So the problem you have here is not just a tax evasion issue, but a criminal cartel issue. The issue comes upon everything that they have put together in so much as evading the tax, and if there's no accountability and transparency. So I've always said to myself, how is it that these governments continue to allow this to go on? Well, of course, the politicians are a part of it, the revolving door, lobbyists, and what will happen ultimately will be whistleblowers will come forward and expose it as they've done recently. This Pandora's paper is just the initial stage of a new phase of whistleblowers wanting to come forward to expose this. Rather than blame the whistleblower, stop breaking the law is the rule of thumb. The whistleblowers are doing the courageous thing to step forward. And most people don't understand what they go through, as I said before. So I think it's important that these laws are strengthened from that standpoint. As well as with Switzerland and what they have done in the past, the question should be, all countries in the European Union should be asking themselves, do they want to give a bank license to UBS in their country? If they continue to break the law, shouldn't they be stopped from operating in that country? And I think that's certainly one of the aspects that we've been talking about. And I think that's what I would push in France, is that their bank charter is revoked, on top of the fine that they're imposed upon. So I think this is what's happened, because in the United States, as I said, the same situation has taken place. Settlements take place, and the bank continues doing its business as normal. So I think what we have here is a society that understands that big money really controls the smaller people of society. And this is not a good system that we want. I'm not pushing for socialism. I'm not pushing for communism. I'm pushing for democracy, a system in which everyone has a voice, but it's a fair voice, and it's a balanced system, not something that's just for the few and the favorite. And I think this is what I saw through my time dealing with this situation with the Department of Justice, dealing with the CIA, dealing with the Treasury Department, dealing with the White House. These people are corrupt, and I'm an American, and I say it candidly. That doesn't mean I dislike America, I dislike the system. And when I see it's wrong, I'll say it's wrong. So I think this is important for people to understand. This is not just me coming up here and telling you a story. This is a true life story, which I experienced. And I think it's important for people to understand, I don't want it to happen to the next person. And I think a lot of people understand it's a very trying time. But I knew it was the right thing to do, so that's why I did it. So I continued to go through my system of exposing fraud around the world, but I then wrote my book, Lucifer's Banker. Why did I write the book? I wrote the book to educate and inform. And to me, this was very important. By doing that, what happened was I now gave people a reason to come forward. This has motivated other whistleblowers who normally wouldn't have come forward. So I think this is very important, because when you give someone a ray of hope, some motivation, this is something that's very, very telling, because most people don't know what to do in that situation as a whistleblower. So then, of course, I then complemented my book with my website, of course, and I thought it was important to put documents, internal documents about UBS on there. And people said, well, I don't think you should be doing this. I said, why? He says, well, you might get sued or something. I said, I don't mind. I haven't done anything wrong. To the contrary, I've been exposing a global crime committed by UBS. So this is very important. And people tell me, you've gotten all this money and you should just move forward. No, it's not about the money. It's about making sure that other people don't get caught up in the same situation, as well as educating people to the facts. Because the facts speak louder than words. Most people today don't really understand the story that I went through, as well as the fact that they said, well, you did it for the money. No, I actually started whistleblowing before the law was even passed. So that's not true. So I think more and more people have to understand, come together and work, not only with governments and law enforcement, but also nonprofits, lawyers, accountants, bankers, whatever it might be, to make sure that we all understand that this is for the good for all of us. And I think what's happened with some of the whistleblowing laws, law enforcement should understand that whistleblowing is an extension of law enforcement. You have to understand that they're doing your job for you, so help them. Now, you may be under-budgeted, or you may be understaffed. That's fine, I understand. Or you're part of the problem, which is the case in my situation with the Department of Justice, is that you must understand that we should work together. Shouldn't be adversarial. This is something where everyone can benefit from this. And the whistleblowing community understands this, but we just have to educate more politicians to this side of the coin to understand that this is a very important matter. But I think in closing, I think what I've tried to convey to you today is the story of my saga with whistleblowing, exposing the global criminal cartel of UBS, and making sure that going forward, we all understand how are we going to implement these new laws in Europe. That's really the question here, because Europe really has fallen behind with respect to the legislation that's required. So I welcome many questions on this matter, and I want to thank you very much for having me here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bradley. Do come and take a seat.
Thank you.
Thanks for your very Very passionate presentation. So I'm sure we do have some questions from the viewers, and let's take a look at that. First of all, a question for Mr. Birkenfeld, of course, not for me. Did you feel threatened, afraid for your safety, taking into consideration the gravity and significance of your actions? Was it a difficult decision to make?
It wasn't, actually. When I first made my decision to come forward, it was important because I felt as though not only myself, but my colleagues, the shareholders and the clients of the bank were put at risk. So I felt as though this was very, very serious. So I really stepped forward. Now, I was a single man at the time. Many people who were married with children may have not have done what I had done. But I felt as though if I don't do it now, I'll know that I should have done it. So I would have had regrets. So, no, I had the courage to come forward, and I quit a very well-paid position at UBS as a director.
You were served a prison sentence. Was that a surprise for you?
No, it wasn't, actually, because, again, that's the corruption within the U.S. system. The question should be, why didn't the Department of Justice uncover this? This is the largest tax fraud scandal in history. Where were they for the last 50 years? So that's the first question. The second question was, the justice system is not justice, it's a business. And I think I've said this many times in interviews before, that the prison system in America is about giving prosecutors this idea that they're going to be hired as big attorneys in law firms, and they need to make numbers of prosecutions. And the courts and the judges and the jails all play along with this. It's really quite a collusion, a system of collusion. It's quite sad, actually.
You talk about people need to know what whistleblowers go through. So if I may ask you a more personal question, how did you get, was it 3 years in prison?
Yes, it was 2.5 years, actually, 30 months.
How did you get through that time?
Well, it wasn't your normal prison that you see on the Hollywood movies, but it was still, your freedom is taken away. But I sensed this was going to happen from the beginning when I came in and whistleblowed to the Department of Justice. The hostility they showed towards me was very, very aggressive, because I actually did their job. They don't need to work, because I could have a team of whistleblowers that would do their job. But going to the prison I went to, it was eye-opening, because it showed to me how corrupt the system really is. Not because people say you're in prison and you deserve to be there, because the system's corrupted. And this goes back to what I said before. The whole system is ingrained in this culture of, we're going to enforce our laws in this way, and you really have no say. And I saw people in prison that never should have been in prison, actually. It was quite sad.
Okay. We've got more questions from the viewers. Robert Ravenchuk, I hope that's how you pronounce your name. Thank you very much for sending in your question. His question is, should whistleblowers get paid and rewarded based on a percentage of the money recovered? There's a constant public battle about that. What is your stand? There is also perhaps a conflict of interest on how much you get paid. That's a good question.
It's a very good question, and I think it's very simple. The question is, if you uncover a crime, those proceeds you get come from the crime. So if you never came forward, the monies wouldn't be there. That's the first thing. So the taxpayer doesn't pay us, it comes from the crime. Secondly, it takes a lot of courage to come forward, and you should be paid a percentage of it, whether it's 100 million or if it's 500 billion. If there's a crime out there that exists of that size and someone's willing to come forward to expose it and get them terminate the crime, that's a good thing. So you've terminated the crime, you've got the funds back for society, and you get a small portion. Again, it's an extension of law enforcement. You're doing law enforcement's job, but better, because you're an inside person giving this information and taking extreme risks between your finances, your emotional health and well-being, as well as your reputation.
But isn't there a conflict of interest there? If the potential that you have to gain is so much more than your annual salary, then whistleblowers could be seen to be manipulated by the money that they...
I've got a perfect answer.
Okay.
Stop breaking the law. Stop breaking the law. You don't need whistleblowers. It's that simple.
Okay. Another question is from Jacek Prignan. Thank you for sending in your question. What do you think of the latest revelations concerning Facebook by Frances Haugen?
I saw the story. I don't know the young lady. I saw that she testified in the Congress, which I wasn't allowed to testify in Congress myself. Again, Congress likes to showboat some of these cases because it fits their narrative. She probably has a very good point about what she's talking about, and Facebook is too controlling, it's too big. And I think, again, here's a courageous woman who stepped forward. I believe she quit her job. She wasn't fired. I don't know the facts, but I think it's a good thing. And again, this sends another message. Society's tired of dealing with these situations in which the little guy, if you will, or girl, is being repressed. And repressed, whether it's through taxes or Facebook and things like this. These have to change. And whistleblowers are the ones who are actually correcting society.
Okay, we have more questions for you. Nika Costa, thank you for sending your question in. Do we need an international whistleblowing institute who could rule these cases, as governments do not seem to be objective enough dealing with these matters?
Well, an international whistleblowing institute is a great idea. I'm actually working on setting up an office here in Europe to handle these laws and to change them and to strengthen them. I've worked in Romania, I've worked in France, and here in Germany as well on this matter. I think it's important, but it has to be empowered. You can't just set up something if you don't have the power. Now, certainly I won't be empowered by governments, because certainly they don't want to give me that kind of power, and I don't really want it. But I think it's important to have maybe an ombudsman of some kind made up of whistleblowers who can actually dictate to the politicians and say, look, you need to change certain things which are better for society, whether it's in the financial areas, whether it's in the medical areas, military, construction. These areas all affect our lives on a daily basis. So if you don't come up with a system that actually holds these people accountable, how do you know what's going on? You don't. So it's a good idea.
Okay. Another question from Simon Gerdemann. Thank you for sending in your question, Simon. Looking at the different whistleblower reward programs in place, SEC, IRS, FCA, and so on, which program do you think works best or would work best in Europe? And which core aspects do you think are crucial for success?
Another excellent question. Again, as we say, you want to take baby steps when you're going to take a system from America and maybe overlay it here into Europe. But that's where we need people to come in and be a part of this conversation. NGOs and politicians have to sit at the same table and say, look, don't be so pushback on this idea. This is a good system that will work for everyone. So the IRS system is the one I came under, the IRS whistleblowing program. My attorney actually wrote the law, Dean Zerby, who actually knows it better than anyone because he was the author. But I think those are the types of people I could bring to Europe who would help European politicians implement a new law to make it better for all Europeans.
Okay, well, then we get onto the EU directive, whistleblowing directive. What do you think of that?
Well, my attorney and I, my other attorney, Steve Cohen, we wrote a letter to the EU Commission and the president at the time, Mr. Juncker, who again is conflicted because he represents Luxembourg. He has a clear conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. And I think the problem with the situation was we wrote a 18-page letter back 5 years ago. It's on my website. And we got no response, none whatsoever. Why it's very important about the EU directive is, as an American working for a foreign institution, UBS, I exposed the largest tax scandal in the world. So it doesn't matter where you're from or where the organization exists. It just matters that we have laws in place to protect and compensate whistleblowers properly. So the EU directive, which is coming out in December, is very important. I was in Bucharest working with some politicians on this. And there was some resistance, of course, because of the old communist thinking. But this is something that we have to change. We're in 2021. We must come up with these laws that help everyone. And this is better for everyone. The only one who wins without whistleblowing are the bad guys.
Do you think a modern whistleblowing system would have had a greater impact on your situation?
Well, I should have gone to the IRS, not the DOJ, and some of the protections there. But the problem is with the justice system in America, as I said, it's a corrupt system. I mean, the quote is, you can indict a ham sandwich there. So everyone indicts everyone there, and you can see why the jails are full of people who shouldn't be there, actually. And some of the laws are just so archaic. So it's a very complex system. But I expected this from my country, but I didn't expect to the extent they did it. But I think strong whistleblowing policies have taken place in America, and they've strengthened them considerably for government employees more and more. Mm-hmm.
We've got another question from Margaret Daly. Thank you for sending in your question, Margaret. What was the trigger light bulb moment where you stuck your heels in and blew the whistle? Was it that your back was up against the wall and you felt there was no other choice if your integrity was to remain intact? Thank you for sharing your story. I mean, she's giving you a very loaded question there, but yeah.
It is. No, and that's fine.
What was the moment, that you realized that there was a problem?
Well, again, as I said in my lecture, what we did was legal in Switzerland. It was when we left Switzerland where it was a gray area, if you will. So that's important to understand. But really what came down to it was a 3-page document, which is in my book and on my website, called Cross-Border Business transactions. So really what that was slipped into our intranet, and we weren't told about it, and we weren't trained on it. So really it was something to set us up for a fall. So I recognize this, but as the only American there on the Swiss desk, none of the Swiss were going to say anything. So I took it upon myself saying, I see exactly what they're trying to do here. And this was really set up by them. This was their document. This was their business model. So what I did was I went to my legal and compliance department and complained. As a director, I managed $500 million for the bank. Why won't you answer me? So for 3 months, they never answered me, and I resigned. And I was the highest paid private banker for UBS in Switzerland. Yeah. Okay. So I gave up everything. I wasn't fired. I gave up everything because they wouldn't answer me. This was their business, not mine. I was a cog in the wheel, but I wasn't the whole process.
Okay. We have more questions for you from Sophocles Karapiadakis. Thank you for sending your question in. From what you've said, I conclude that you would have done this again. The question is, what would you do differently? Well, would you do it again?
I would do it again, obviously, and it's a great question because I wouldn't have gone to the Department of Justice. Right. And I would tell anyone they're not to be trusted, number one, and I think you could see in recent news reports how corrupt the FBI and the Department of Justice really are. But I would have gone to the IRS and gotten criminal immunity given to me as an informant. And that's given all the time. It's just that the Department of Justice prefers to prosecute and the IRS prefers to get cases settled. And this was the biggest case of all time.
Okay. Seeing as the consequences are so severe for whistleblowers on a very personal level, what would you say to encourage employees to speak up?
Well, they have to feel comfortable in the organization they work in. Do they feel as though they trust their boss in the larger organization? That's one point. The other point is that you don't want to be going into an organization that you know is maybe a bit shady to begin with. You don't know everything about an organization, obviously. This Facebook scenario is a perfect case in point. So I think more and more people have to understand that whistleblowing laws should be in place, but also whistleblowing policies within the company level should be in place. And they should be monitored properly, communicated effectively, and followed up. Because if they don't, then it means nothing. So these are very important facts which will help the company operate better and more efficiently, not only for the clients, for the colleagues, and for the shareholders, but overall. Because if you start to have these problems, you have reputational risk, fines, indictments, and so forth. So a good whistleblowing policy within an organization should be done across the board, worldwide. Why are you against it? What do you have to hide?
Was this something that you thought about at all before you took on the job at UBS in Switzerland?
No, I actually was working in Switzerland for Credit Suisse and then Barclays Bank, and then I was headhunted to UBS. But, you know, I knew what UBS did, but I understood that it was legal what we did in Switzerland. I mean, it's in their constitution. So it's not as though I was naive. But when it got to the point where we were in that gray area, as I talked about, going from Switzerland to, say, America, or Switzerland to any other country for that matter, there's laws that are in place, and you must respect those laws. And I think that's really what we're talking about here. And UBS never respected those laws. They just wanted the money.
Okay, another question from Cesar Gomez. Thanks for sending your question in. I would like your opinion about how to keep and forces the employee and public's understand the high importance in use of the whistleblower channel. So I think that's a communication question. Like how do you communicate the importance of it?
Well, first you have to have a good whistleblowing policy within the organization. So that should be vetted, obviously, by compliance and legal, external as well. And then make sure it's communicated effectively to all employees so they can feel comfortable about coming forward if they see something that's wrong. I'm not talking about someone stealing some paper towel or candy from the machine or something like this. It's big corporate fraud we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. Let's be honest. Mm-hmm. And I think that's really the essence that will bring down a corporation. Enron is a perfect example of that. And Sharon Watkins, a friend of mine, she was the one who exposed them. Harry Markopoulos, another friend of mine, exposed Madoff. But if you had a whistleblowing policy within the organization, someone might have come forward long before all of these tragedies happened. All the money is lost, people's lives ruined, divorces, suicides, so on and so forth. It's a very sad tragedy. But that's why a strong whistleblowing policy, communicated effectively, will prevent a lot of that.
Okay. It seems to me that misconduct happens at the highest level in companies. So what about training the top management in ethics and compliance? Are those programs in place?
Well, you would hope that they would come in with those ethics already in place, because they most likely have a high level of education, a master's degree, a PhD, what have you, and certainly experience on the job. But the problem is that sometimes they have to be reeled in, as we say. And I think legal and compliance should take that role to making sure that everyone, from the CEO all the way down to the lowest level employee, understands that this is the way we're going to run this corporation. There's not going to be any funny business. If you break the law or you have something unethical, you're going to be reprimanded or fired. And I think that's the way you protect yourself. Plus, your insurance carrier for the corporation would welcome this. Why? Because it makes their job easier, knowing there's not some hidden scandal within the organization, and the clients and the colleagues would like it because it's a nice, safe work environment to be in, not something where you're always on pins and needles, as we say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, another question from Sharad Kumar. Bradley, in your opinion, what is more important for employees to come forward, the corporate policy and support, whistleblowing laws, or community sensitivities or society sensitivities, as I think you can paraphrase?
Well, I think the main thing is, depending upon where you work, you have to first think about what you do with that organization. What's your role there? Are you a part of the problem, or are you a part of the solution? That's the first thing, if you see something wrong. I think community sensitivity is important, and whistleblowing laws are important, but most importantly, you've got to start with where you are and where you stand in the situation. After that, if it's a larger problem, then of course you have to make sure that it's reported to either law enforcement or, in some instances, to the media to make sure that it gets exposed. Because if you don't go that route, it may get buried. And that's, in my case, what I did was I went to so many organizations within the U.S. government, they couldn't bury the case. IRS, SEC, DOJ, and U.S. Senate. And there's reports and so forth all about what I had done, so no one could really say they wanted to take the credit for it. In America, it's all about who gets the credit. Mm-hmm. And what I tried to do was show to them that I was the one who was courageous enough to come forward and risk everything, but you tried to make me the bad guy. I mean, I was the only one in the whole financial crisis to go to jail. Mm-hmm.
So is your mission now to get the message to society?
Correct, and coming here today.
To answer that question.
Yes.
Your priority.
It's lectures like this to educate and inform people. That's why I wrote the book and the website. So everyone can ask these wonderful questions and say, geez, what would I do if I was in his shoes? Mm. Would I have done the same? And I'm not saying there's a right or wrong answer there, but it's important for people to be educated and to communicate that effectively.
Okay. UBS has also, he's not the only company, but also settled it with a settlement. Is this the way forward? Is it a good thing to solve corruption issues with settlements?
No, I disagree, and I think settlements should be abolished, because what that does is sends the wrong message. It's rewarding bad behavior. So if you break the law and let's say you steal 100 million and you give back 90 million, what's the sense of that? Because you profit from the crime, you just write a check and pay it off, which you write off to your taxpayers, who then pay that bill, and the shareholders pay the legal bills, who had nothing to do with the crime, and the executives continue doing their work. So settlements, absolutely not. You should hold people accountable, number one. You should fine them the amount that they stole. Let's say they stole 100 million, and then add on another 20% on top, and then put the CEO in jail for a year and see how that goes over. I guarantee you'll put an end to the crimes real fast, and people will not want to do it. Because it's all about, Tanya, you've got to set a precedent, and you have to have a deterrent. Otherwise, people will continue doing the crime.
That's a very clear message. Thank you very much, Bradley Birkenfeld, for joining us today here at the European Compliance and Ethics Conference.
Thank you.